One of our best contacts during the whole occupation was André Tessier. Together with her grocer sister Delande, who lived in the XII arrondissement of Paris, she helped us in every way possible: housing, food, etc. In short, Edwidge, Cecile and I owe our lives to her. In July 1940, André Tessier was the liaison of Eugene Genaff, a member of the Central Committee of the FCP. One day she went to Roger Tieren's printing press and found the printer there with Marcel Le Marec, the former director of the Union Printing Press. A leaflet emerged from the printing press, and André noticed two signatures underneath Maurice Thorez and Jacques Duclos. The proclamation was entitled "To the People of France." It analysed the situation, revealed the causes of war and defeat, the prospects for the struggle for freedom and national independence. Our country is now experiencing the dire consequences of the criminal policy pursued by the despicable rulers responsible for the war, defeat and occupation. The proclamation further stated, "The indignation of a whole deceived people by those who wanted the war and are responsible for the defeat is growing. Nothing can avert the hour of reckoning, the working masses, putting forward the demand France to the French, at the same time expressing the will for the independence of the whole people and a firm determination to end forever with those who brought the country to disaster." The next section revealed the prospects for the future. Leading France wishes to be free and independent. The people of France are capable of resolving all political issues arising from the treachery of the propertied classes in accordance with their traditions. France does not want to be ruled by Vichy adventurers. Never will a great nation like ours become a slave, and if, in defiance of terror, it has been able in various ways to express its opposition to France being chained to the chariot of British imperialism, it will be able to declare to the cap now in power its will to be free. France will not be likened to a colony. France will not kneel before a bunch of lackeys ready to do any dirty deed. Who can elevate France? This can only be achieved by uniting all patriots with the working class, full of courage and self-confidence. Because to it belongs the future, this can only be achieved by uniting patriots with the working class, led by the Communist Party, characterized by the purity of its ranks, honesty and heroism, which can serve as the basis for the creation of a front of freedom, independence, and the revival of the country. On behalf of the Communist Party leadership, Maurice Thorez and Jacques Duclos called on patriots to unite, remembering always that if we all unite, we can elevate France, ensure its freedom, prosperity and independence. This document bore the date July 10, 1940, on which day it was handed to Roger Tieren for printing. Responding to criticism about the date of this document, Jacques Duclos clarified that the typing and proofreading took several days. This is perfectly understandable, especially in underground conditions. While the proofs were being reviewed, new developments took place. In particular, on July 12th, the government was reorganized. Laval became vice president of the Council of Ministers. It was necessary to say something about it, which was done. But the date under the proclamation remained the same: July 10, 1940. If there are those who like to pick on the date, we can make the following clarification. The version of this document was prepared much earlier than July 10th. Victor Joiniers said that he received the first draft on June 20th to 25th, 1940, from Arthur Darlide, who told him use it to draft an appeal to the youth. In our time, this proclamation can quite naturally cause perplexity. It is easy today to criticize it, but it was much more difficult to draft and print this document in June 1940, when the communist activists were scattered. Some were in prisons, others in prisoner of war camps, others outside France, and those who remained were persecuted by the Vichy police and the occupiers. This proclamation should not now be read without taking into account the situation then prevailing. In the weeks following the defeat, a referendum was held, and I am not sure that 90% of the French did not vote for Pétain. In July 1940, the main effort in outreach had to be directed against the illusion created by Pétain, a German protégé. in the book Vichy France 1940 to 1944. American historian Paxton, on the basis of a large number of documents and archival materials, shows that in 1940 to 1944, the franc depreciated faster than all other Western European currencies. With the exception of the lira, it was weaker than the currency of fully occupied Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, etc. Berlin, with the help of the Vichyists, was siphoning off 51% of France's annual budget, and on August 6, 1942, the dapper Goering declared, "I judge the cooperation of the French only by its results. If they give so much that they can give no more, if they do it voluntarily, then I can say I cooperate. A franc should be worth no more than some paper intended for a certain use." It was just such cooperation that the Vichy lackeys led by Pétain enforced through forced labour conscription. In 1943, France, of all the occupied countries in the West and East, supplied the largest number of labourers for the German factories. In November 1943, this number reached 1,344,000 workers, not including prisoners of war working in Germany. France left far behind such areas as Poland and the occupied territories of the USSR, where the forcible stealing of men, women and children was carried out systematically. As for repression, on this subject, German archives have confirmation of the tone of assistance the Vichy administration gave to the Nazis. In his headquarters, Hitler held 2 meetings each day. On December 1, 1942, in the minutes of the second meeting there is the following entry. Jodl reports to Hitler that the French police arrested a group of 6 armed men who attacked the town hall in the department of Saône and Loire. Hitler: excellent. The police are working well. We will harness it to this work, and in the future we will act only with its help. Himmler knows his police. He manages to gradually entrench people with him. This will be an alliance with the French authorities, created with the help of the police. General Jodl: the police leave a better impression than the government. Hitler in France. The police are most despised, so it seeks to find support from a stronger authority than that which exists in its own state. That power is us. The police will insist with ever-increasing persistence that we will not abandon the country. Indeed, the Nazis would never have succeeded in arresting so many patriots if the French police, the mobile Republican Guard and the militia created by the Vichyists, in short, the French themselves, had not gone to their service. The repression became extremely brutal and had dire consequences, something the Germans could not have accomplished if they alone had been forced to confront the French resistance. The Gestapo, even with a cadre specially trained to exercise police control in France, would have been, if not blind and deaf, at least visually impaired and hard of hearing. As far as food supply was concerned, as a result of the Vichy government's policies, France was the most poorly supplied of all the Western countries, save Italy. Hitler once told Mussolini, if the provisions of the armistice of June 17th, and are relatively mild, it is to prevent the possible rejection of them by the French government and the latter's flight to London to continue the war. Nor need I speak of the heavy responsibility which the occupying powers would otherwise have to assume. The third article of the armistice agreement stated, "The French government undertakes to assist the authorities of the Reich in the exercise of all the rights of the occupying power." The proclamation was addressed to a confused population thrown onto the roads of mass flight, then back again when every family had someone in captivity, sometimes a father or other breadwinner. We had to feed the children, the sick. There was no food or work available. In the weeks that followed the surrender, the proclamation gave the whole nation an answer to the questions they were tormented by: how to live, to feed, to work. Who must answer for this terrible defeat, betrayal, confusion? Where is the way out of the situation? Would not Pétain solve all these problems? If no answer could be given to all these questions, which were at the centre of all discussions in the towns and villages of France, there was nothing to be hoped for in the successful search for those paths which in the future were to lead to the unfolding of the resistance movement. Some at first disputed the very existence of the proclamation. Police reports on arrested Communist Party activists mentioning leaflets containing the text of the proclamation dispelled doubts. Others reproached the Communists for the fact that the document referred to the subjugation of France by British imperialism on the eve of 1940. In fact, the timeliness of the mention of these facts can be disputed, but in no way can they be denied. It was the foreign policy of the English ruling circles, conducted by Chamberlain, set the tone for the entire foreign policy of France. Granting freedom of action to Hitler in Austria and Czechoslovakia, the strange war, betrayal, defeat were just a consequence of the orientation determined by London. Who could have predicted at the end of June and even in July 1940 what would be the position of the British ruling circles? Undoubtedly, all affairs were led by Winston Churchill, and his negative attitude to all this policy was known. But would his position not change after June 1940? Would he succeed in carrying it through? To re-establish the lost link, to show that the party is alive, this was, in my opinion, the main concern of the Communist Party and the purpose of the proclamation written by Maurice Thorez and Jacques Duclos. It is written on behalf of those who have been most persecuted for about a year now, and who have tried to present themselves as strangers in their homeland, of which they were the best sons. Let anyone criticize us today, one fact is indisputable apart from leaflets distributed here and there by individual courageous fighters and scattered small groups. Only the French Communist Party published illegal publications in 1940. For 5 years, the Communists were systematically repressed. From September 1939 to August 1944, the Communist Party steadfastly pursued its course, and this despite the fact that many of its activists were shot, guillotined, imprisoned, sent to concentration camps, and killed in action. The party continued its explanatory work and fought vigorously. Sometimes we had to go groping, misguided, and made mistakes. No communist is going to deny that. The transition from the strange war to the Nazi occupation presented a number of problems for comrades returning to the Paris district after the mass flight. It was during these days that misconceptions and serious mistakes took place. Those responsible for them had been fighting Nazism for a long time, many of them subsequently killed, some survived and returned from the death camps. They had to endure the double blow of the enemy and their own past mistakes. Some are now ready to condemn these people. I say, paraphrasing Clemenceau's words about the French Revolution, I accept entirely and defend the remarkable struggle of all my comrades in 1940 to 1944, without exception, with all their mistakes and feats. In June-July 1940, the work was fraught with great difficulties. The leading core of the party was not in place. It was necessary to establish communication with the periphery. At all costs, it was necessary to express its position and show that the party was alive. The enemy made it difficult to accomplish all these tasks. The French saw how the so-called informational newspapers of the pre-war period were revived under Goebbels' control: Paris Soir, Paris Midi, Petit Parisien Matin. The radicals' newspaper El Euro ended up in the hands of the French Nazi Marcel Diet. The traitor Doriot came to the fore with his newspaper Cri du People. All of them spread the contagion of Nazi ideology. Many other disgraced tabloid newspapers, like La Garbe, began to appear, trying to sneak Nazi ideology and the spirit of collaboration with Hitler's regime into the middle classes. One example illustrates the difficulties faced during those terrible times of 1940. At the end of May, Cécile fell ill. She was bedridden for 2 whole months in June and July, first in a shelter for elderly women in Paris, then in Saint-Julien-le-Ville, until Edwidge came for her and took her to Troyes. Early in July, she was visited by a group of young communists from Alfortville, including Odette Henriot, Breisler, Raymond Jacquelard, and several others. For a number of years, I had been acquainted with the Henriot family. The couple joined the Communist Party on the basis of a policy of uniting anti-fascist forces. During my military service, I went every evening to their small house on Rue de Juif in Juif, the newspaper Humanite, which was banned in the barracks. After the November 1938 strike, Odette's father Henriot was transferred by the railroad company to Paris and lived in Alphaville. In 1939, Cécile, under the direction of Danielle Casanova, was engaged in mailing the banned Humanite to mobilized comrades and liaising with the commissioners in the army. Then, with my help, she was taken in by the Henriot family. Thus, through Odette Henriot, she met my friends from the Union of Communist Youth of Alphaville. All of them were real communists. On that July day in 1940, they gathered together at Cécile's hospital bedside. They came in high spirits, bringing a newspaper called France au Travail. This newspaper was printed at the Humanite printing house. Only the title and content of the newspaper had changed. Renegades expelled from the ranks of the FCP before 1939 and during the war printed their articles in it. Here one could find resolutions and formulations attributed to the workers, such as free the prisoners, confiscate war profits, restore production in the factories, all diluted with anti-Semitism. Now you see, said Cécile's friends, Humanite is being printed again, though in a different form. Although Cécile was sick, here she was indignant. You're crazy. You have forgotten the very essence of Nazism. He was and will be our worst enemy. Not only are we not on our way to a legal existence, on the contrary, we are on our way to an even deeper and harder underground. We have no illusions about legalization. We are in danger of learning what the German communists have been experiencing since 1933. Nevertheless, the newspaper France au Travail, founded by the Nazis for the former readers of Humanite, had some success for a number of weeks and even months. We had to establish a printing base in the face of repression to distribute illegally printed newspapers and leaflets while observing the necessary precautions. It was necessary to expose definitively the role played by the newspaper France au Travail, which had become an organ of Goebbels' propaganda. Under occupation, like glowing embers under a layer of ashes, the illegal press gave its answer to the press of the Vicyists and the occupiers. These publications were usually reproduced on a rotator in damp cellars, barns, or in even worse conditions. In every neighborhood, our ideas made their way through. Our press was a nuisance to the occupiers and the Vicyists. On September 30th, 1940, the Paris Gestapo reported to Himmler. To put an end to any new intensification of communist propaganda in Paris, the Paris police will take a number of preventive measures, including the arrest and internment in camps of all known Communist Party leaders and activists in Paris who can be suspected of being directly or indirectly involved in the production and distribution of leaflets or could be involved in the future. The matter has been discussed with Ambassador Abetz, and the latter agrees to this even on condition that the arrests, internment and detention of those arrested be carried out by the French themselves. The Prefecture of Police is still searching for an appropriate camp. As soon as such a place is found, it will move to practical action. When I was a municipal councillor of Paris, I had to look through a yellowed collection of the municipal bulletins of the city of Paris published during those dark years of occupation. In the volume for the second half of 1940, I found only one decree of the Prefect of Police of Langeron on illegal publications. It is dated October 21st, 1940, and concerns Communist Party leaflets. The discovery of leaflets in the territory of any commune in the department of Seine shall entail the forced internment of one or more known communists residing in the territory of the commune in question. Apparently, the Prefect of Police did not wait until the above date to begin mass arrests of communists. From July 1st to July 7th, 1940, in the Paris district alone, 9 underground organizations producing and distributing leaflets were destroyed, 90 activists were arrested, and 63 people were forcibly interned. The repression continued uninterrupted from July to October 1940. In the department of Seine-et-Oise, the prefect Marc Chevalier, for his part, also promulgated a decree on October 21st, in which the power given to him by the occupiers stated, For the last time, I warn the instigators of riots who believe that they have done no harm to their country in the past by making demagogic demands, but now continue their campaign of inciting hatred and unrest in anonymous leaflets and posters. On the basis of my decision in the decree of October 19th, such actions in any commune in the Seine and Oise department will result in the punishment of immediate forced internment of the main Communist Party activists residing in the commune in question. There are still acts of sabotage against the military equipment of the occupying army. I find no words to express my censure for these despicable and treacherous attempts, because their consequences are harmful only to yourselves. Whoever commits such criminal acts is not worthy to be called a citizen, and is subject to the most severe punishment in all fairness. You will only be able to benefit your country by winning the respect of the occupation authorities, with whom I am cooperating quite loyally in your own interests, and by correct, disciplined behavior consistent with French reputation and French tradition. Obviously, in order to better respect traditions, the prefect immediately added "done at Versailles" on October 21st, 1940. In these disgusting documents, the Nazi code on hostages was already visible, and future victims were being mapped out. Practically, we stood then at the beginning of a long and hard battle, but not all communists had the opportunity to go underground. All financial, material, and family problems could not be resolved. The reality is terrible, but it is worth recalling all 27 of those shot at Chateaubriand were arrested after Langeron and Chevalier published their ominous decrees of October 21st, 1940, and in the last days of November of the same year. The Gestapo and the prefects were concerned only with communists, but many were looking for associates, and these people were not communists. A patriotic group formed around Boris Wilde, Leon Maurice Nordman, Anatole Levitsky, Agnes Humbert, Chan Kasu, Germain Fillon, Jacques Billiou and others. Paul Rivet, who before the war had led the Vigilance Committee of Anti-Fascist Intellectuals, sowed good seeds. Continuing to develop its actions, the group established contact with the Communist Party, which was in the underground, through Jacques Billiou came to Georges Politzer and then Jean Jerome. A number of small circulation newspapers appeared, which people usually passed from hand to read. But there were few such publications in 1940. Pantagruel, Valmy, Défense de la France. Trade unionists Christian Pinault, Robert Lacoste, Niemeyer in late 1940, early 1941, founded the newspaper Liberation Nord. Jean Lieber, former Minister of Labour in the Popular Front government, Mayor of Roubaix, printed the newspaper El Homme Libre on a rotator. The first issue contained the article Socialism Exists, which stated, "Today we see that our party has not ceased to exist, as the enemies wished. Some are trying to speak of its final destruction, blaming all the crimes and responsibility for the disasters that have occurred mainly as a result of the treachery of those who have always opposed the struggle of the Communist Party for the emancipation of the people." This newspaper was distributed only in the Lille area. The Socialist Party was going through a severe crisis. Its General Secretary joined the Pétain National Council. Many deputies from this party supported the Vichysts. Gerard Jacquet assessed the actions of the Socialists. The Socialist Party itself clearly demonstrated its ignominious collapse. In November 1940, a small group of about 10 people under the leadership of Jacques Yatioui published the newspaper Lettre aux Français, however, a small circulation. This group later grew to become a paramilitary civilian organization. Ripochet founded the newspaper CD La Résistance, and the young philosopher Philippe Vianet, an activist of Christian organizations, founded the newspaper Défense de la France. The first steps of these small groups revealed the courage of their members, especially since they were unable to rely on any pre-war organizations or state institutions for their work. In time, they became the basis of various movements, which then merged into a national organization. In the second half of 1940 and even in 1941, there was only one organization in the whole of France, which, in the face of the most severe persecution by the Vichyists and the Nazis, strengthened itself organizationally everywhere. Like a tree taking root in fertile soil, the Communist Party strengthened its influence in factories, in universities, in the public and civil services, among housewives, and among the toilers of the countryside. The English newspaper Daily Telegraph in the December 20th, 1940 issue wrote, "There is, albeit illegally, only one party, namely the Communist Party. Over 1,000 of its activists have been arrested in the last month. They distributed anti-German leaflets with appeals to the patriotic feelings of the French." The collaborationist press also confirmed it. At a time when, under conditions of heavy defeat, all political parties have ceased mass work, only the communists have maintained their organization, only they are making appeals to the people, trying to involve them in the struggle. This is much more dangerous than at the top might have supposed. Of course, as long as the occupying army remains in our country, firm order will be maintained here. But then what? A similar concern was voiced in the pages of all the collaborationist newspapers of the period. From July to December 1940, a harsh battle raged. 1,200 activists were arrested in the Paris district alone. In other districts, those arrested already numbered in the thousands, and since 1939 some 10,000 had been thrown into prisons. All this forced the party to rebuild its ranks underground. Thousands of men, women, and young activists carried on the struggle throughout the country. Those who fell in the struggle were replaced by new fighters. The situation at that time is particularly vividly set forth in the report of the Paris Gestapo of February 24, 1941, addressed to Heydrich, who headed the detective police and security service in Berlin. Works of the 53 pages of this report, Nockin devotes 4 pages to the organized movement of the Gaullists, 2 pages to the Frankmasons, 3 to the Church, and 12 to the French Communist Party. On the activities of the Communists, the Gestapo chief writes, "During the last weeks of February 26, different Communist publications were seized, and among them were the Humanite, the Vie Ouvrière, l'Avant-Garde, and others. Some of these publications are issued by local groups and do not differ in content from the newspapers mentioned." He went on to give a long list of all the cities in France in which party activists had been arrested, printing presses vandalized, and weapons seized. Among these cities were named Paris, Bordeaux, Amiens, Vendôme, Orléans, Nancy, Dijon, Lille, Châteauroux, Nimes, Montpellier, Clermont-Ferrand, Périgueux, Marseille, and others. Documents from German archives show that in late 1940 and early 1941 the propaganda and militant work of the communists in France was of great concern to the Nazis. In a report on the communist movement in France for the week from January 24 to 31, 1941, the following can be read. Despite the vigorous measures of the French police authorities against the communists, there has not been any weakening of their propaganda work ... From previous reports it appears, and we must draw attention to this, that communist propaganda is gradually assuming clearly defined organizational forms and is being carried out more and more systematically. The newspapers give details of the treacherous role of the French bourgeoisie, make attacks against the existing government, called by the authors of the articles a capitalist dictatorship, and contain appeals to the struggle for the freedom and independence of France. Particular emphasis in communist propaganda is placed on the present situation in the country, on the difficulties in the supply of food, unemployment, and so on, emphasizing the need for the establishment of people's committees. Among other matters, this report reports on the work of the Communist Party in decomposing the Wehrmacht and establishing communist cells in German troops. It can be stated with full confidence that among the soldiers there are a large number of former communists favorable to the work of the French Communist Party. The report for the week from January 17 to 24, 1941, dealt with the creation of strike groups of the special organization. A strike group of 6 to 8 men is assigned the tasks of surveillance and cover for acts of retaliation and sabotage. They are also engaged in distribution of newspapers, distribution of leaflets. In addition, we found out that the Communist Party has organized the collection of weapons, creates secret warehouses. Communist propaganda activity in the unoccupied zone has increased considerably, and the Vichy government believes that in the spring of 1941 communist riots will intensify. 62 copies of illegal publications distributed have been seized. On October 23, 1940, Nazi Marcel Dive wrote the following to the newspaper El Euro. In their newspapers, the communists speak only of the independence and liberation of France. Dedicated to their cause, they seek to draw into their orbit all existing political currents, and in time they will become followers of de Gaulle. On November 6, 1940, in the same newspaper, he pointed out, I have already said that the communists have turned into nationalists. Their newspapers contain conclusions quite similar to the Gaullist aims. It is only about the liberation and independence of France. They try to assure us that only the communists can fully restore its sovereignty. On November 23, 1940, still in the same newspaper, DA emphasized, I recently saw a communist newspaper which mercilessly insulted Marshal Pétain, at the same time calling upon the French to unite on the basis of patriotism around the banned party in order to create better conditions for the liberation of the fatherland. Communists praise patriotism and nationalism as hard as they can. Whether they realize it or not, they act as bribed or willing agents of British intelligence, although their ultimate aspiration is quite different. They no longer speak only of the victory of democracy with the help of the British, but proclaim the complete victory of communism by revolutionary means. It is enough to remember that the danger of the Popular Front, which was spawned by Bolshevism, consisted precisely in the unusual fusion of aggressive militant neo-nationalism and anti-fascism. At the same time, the Popular Front believed that it had traditionally been rightfully destined for a republic and socialism. The Gestapo, in a January 1941 report, in turn reported on the communist movement in France. In all propaganda there is a pronounced nationalistic direction. All Frenchmen are encouraged to join the one and only party in France which is capable of restoring freedom and independence to the country. The Communist Party reaffirms its intention to extend a hand of friendship to every Frenchman whose heart is close to the national interest. On the eve of Hitler's attack on the USSR, DA wrote, Communism is the cousin of Gaullism. He set only one goal to exclude any rapprochement between France and Germany. It plays into the hands of the City of London and Washington Wall Street. No, the French communists were not agents of the city, Wall Street, or Moscow. They were members of a party that concentrated all its efforts on uniting popular and national forces. In November 1940, the French Communist Party was the only one of all parties to oppose the annexation of Alsace. The Communist Party read the illegally published Humanate, in the name of all Frenchmen worthy of the name, curses the government which has brought poverty and slavery, which has committed treason, which has acquiesced in the annexation of Alsace, which has trampled on the freedom of France in return for the fact that with the help of foreign bayonets, it has been able to hold on to power. On May 15, 1941, the FCP issued a call for the creation of a national front to fight for French independence. This appeal stated, guided solely by the desire to build a nationwide alliance for the sacred cause of national independence, the French Communist Party, which places the interests of the fatherland above all else, solemnly declares that in order to create a broad front of national liberation, it is ready to support any French government, any organization and all those figures whose efforts will be directed towards waging an effective struggle against the regime of national oppression and traitors in France, which reigns in France. The flame of struggle that had flared up in 1940 flared up even brighter and stronger a year later. In response to increased repression, more and more freedom fighters rose up. Gilbert Brusselin escaped arrest because he went to Nantes to carry out the operation. He entrusted Fernand Zolkinov with the command of a group of battalions of youth of the XI district during his absence. He left him a room on the Avenue Philippi or Gasti, rented under an assumed name. Barely Gilbert had time to leave for Nantes, as 7 of the best fighters of the Group XI district were arrested. This was due to lack of vigilance and lack of weapons, which had to be obtained, not always observing precautions. A soldier of this group Ganel was acquainted with one Hubert, who was going to sell some revolvers with ammunition. At the time, the Nazis had announced that possession of the weapons would be punishable by death, so they could be found in junkyards and other places. Hubert was a buddy of Ganel's, although he was not a member of the resistance organization. The revolvers intended for sale he showed to his fiancée. From the chatter the matter was exposed, became known to the police. Ganel was followed. The police uncovered a safe house on Philippe Auguste Avenue and arrested, together with Ganel Faria Fernand Zolkinov, telegraph operator Pierre Milan, construction worker Asher Simayat. Torture completed the rest. Students Christian Rizot and Tony Blancourt were added to the 4 arrested. All 6 lived in the XI arrondissement. Robert Peltier, a metal modeler who lived in Goussainville, was also arrested. Returning from Nantes, Gilbert walked to the house number 126, Avenue Philippe Auguste, and through the window noticed suspicious movements in the room he knew so well. He immediately remembered that back in Nantes he had seen an advertisement in a newspaper saying that there was a bounty on his head. Suspicious, he passed his house and instinctively went to No. 1 Rue Montreux, where his mother lived, but he had been warned that the police had been keeping watch at his mother's house for several days. In the XI arrondissement, the Arab telephone had been operating reliably, because since 1940 a great many communists had been arrested here and then extradited to the German authorities. Many people knew about the arrests and the threat that Gilbert faced. It was also known that the police were waiting for Gilbert in the house of a wallpaper maker in Montreuil Street. So his friends managed to warn him about it. They also told Gilbert about the arrest of his best friends. What to do? Many of us have experienced times like this in the dark night of the Nazi occupation, when during the day you don't know what awaits you in the evening. Gilbert searched his memory for possible safe houses and remembered one named Bouvier. Shouldn't he ask permission to spend the night there? The Bouvier couple worked at the Spanish Suiza Company and lived on Place Alice in the XVT arrondissement. In the evening, Gilbert knocked on their door. Despite the danger they were in, they welcomed him. The next day, Gilbert had a meeting with Liliane Levy, whose husband Simon Lichtenstein was Gilbert's companion in a small trading business on the Rue de la Santière. After overcoming many difficulties, Liliane was able to see Colonel Dumont, who was also looking for Gilbert. The colonel did not have a safe house, but until better times, Gilbert settled Gilbert in the laboratory. Under the name of Journet, Colonel Jules Dumont rented an apartment in the XIX district in the Street de Bidor. It was this premises that we called the laboratory here. Claudia, a young, talented chemist, set up the production of bombs, grenades and incendiary bottles. The gatekeeper in the house where the laboratory was housed was our comrade Couliboeuf. He set up a bed for Gilbert in the midst of bombs, grenades, revolvers, combustible materials, bottles of sulfuric acid. Claudia, Dumont, Fabienne and Marette Musty came here periodically. In this arsenal Gilbert had to stay all day long, as he was not allowed to go outside. Couliboeuf brought a daily lunch from Mamma Mie from a café on the boulevard Sororia, a stone's throw from the laboratory. This café before the war belonged to the deputy of the XIX district Jacques Rez, who fought in the international brigades in Spain, was wounded. Such was the husband of Constance Renénot, a personal friend of Colonel Dumont. It was he who informed us that there was a vacant apartment in Rue de Bidor, and that our dear Theo, a German anti-fascist and veteran of the international brigades, lived in that house. Although Jules Dumont was a major figure in the anti-fascist movement and the special organization from its inception, he very often broke the rules of conspiracy. I recall the answers of this valiant warrior to my questions related to the security of the laboratory. He replied, "Calm down. We have a German comrade from the international brigades, and where he is, there is order." But the glorious Theo could not do anything contrary to the decisions of his leader. Jules Dumont decided to move to a new apartment. It was difficult for him to do it alone, and he took with him Gilbert Brustlin, who was hiding at Claudia's. This small breach of the rules of conspiracy had irreparable consequences. Afterward, Coulebeuf refused to bring Gilbert lunches. He stated, "If you think it possible for you to leave the house for such trifles, you can go to the café for lunch yourself." Every day at noon and in the evening, Gilbert began to come to the Boulevard Serruria. The café was frequented mostly by labourers. Apparently, dozens or even hundreds of resistance members ate there without cards, and as a rule, for free. Many underground members, as soon as they were hungry, went to Mamma Mie's, even though they knew it was not safe. Constance Rapino was a wonderful comrade. She gave the last of what she had, did everything she could for our persecuted comrades. Under these conditions, contrary to the elementary rules of conspiracy, what was bound to happen happened. One of the policemen unexpectedly overheard a careless conversation at the counter. As it turned out later from the German archives, since November 3, 1941, the café had been under surveillance by special brigades. On November 19th, a photograph of Gilbert Brustlin was printed in all newspapers. In addition, his portrait was hung on the walls of houses. Hundreds of people saw him at Mamma Mie's. He was known to many residents of District XI. After looking through the newspapers on November 19th, Gilbert took his suitcase and left Claudia's room, not knowing where he would find shelter. He did so in good time. On November 25th, the police overheard a conversation between Coulebeuf and a visitor to the café, and then searched the apartment on the Rue de Bidor. The police discovered a laboratory there. A report on the matter in the German archives says that the police seized an infernal machine, 45 charges of toll, detonators, Bickford cord, 250 charges of dynamite, a dozen incendiary bombs, 20 incendiary bottles, sulfuric acid, potassium chloride, 150 revolvers and ammunition for them. It may be said that Colonel Dumont wasted no time, but it was a mistake to keep so many weapons in one place. Coulebeuf and his wife, Constance Rapinot, and Camille Sampson were arrested. The latter was the head of a team of sewer workers, members of the resistance. As is known, the death penalty was imposed for possession of weapons, and Sampson collected revolvers in the sewers and took them to Mamma Mie for subsequent transfer to Colonel Dumont. However, the police raid was only half successful. The spies were unable to arrest any of the leaders. Colonel Dumont, Franz Bloch, Fabienne and Marette Musty were still at large. Fabienne almost fell into the clutches of this mob. When he arrived at Mamma Mie's house and went up to the second floor, he noticed that 2 types from the special brigades were following him. So he locked the door behind him and jumped into the street from the second floor. Gilbert Brustlin was now all alone, just as he had been when he arrived from Nantes, but now his picture was in all the newspapers and on the walls of the houses. He had an appointment with Marette Musty, but only for November 20th. Where to go? He had to find a place to sleep at all costs. Gilbert thought of his mother's clients in St. Mandy. They weren't communists, just friends. The head of the family was a cabinet maker, the wife a housewife, the only 22-year-old daughter a French teacher. These good people despised the Germans, but dared not put themselves at great risk by sheltering a terrorist. The death sentence threatened Gilbert, as well as whoever harbored him. The whole family gathered in the room, leaving Gilbert alone in the kitchen. It was the girl who had saved him. Gilbert was reached by her voice. "You cowards," she threw to her parents. If you send him outside now, he will be captured and shot by the Germans. Will you be able to sleep well after that?" Gilbert spent that night in St. Mandé. The next day, Maret must found him refuge with a family of Italian anti-fascists in a house near the Rue de Parinette, near the railroad bridge. Here he lived until early December 1941. The national leadership was aware of Gilbert Brustline's dramatic situation. His further stay in France was tantamount to imminent condemnation to death. We suggested that he leave for England. Fabian and Miret Musti were instructed to supply him with money and to give him the necessary assistance. Now Gilbert Brustline was in for a real odyssey. He studied the map, deciding to cross the demarcation line at the small station of Saint-Couin in the department of Chiers. When he got off the train, the station master suddenly approached him and made him go to his office. There he said to Gilbert, "You are lucky, there are no Krauts today. On another day they would have captured you. Surely you want to cross the demarcation line." All day Gilbert hid in the woods, and at night he crossed the demarcation line a few hundred meters from the station. Once in the southern zone, he left by train for Perpignan and arrived there the next day. In Perpignan lived Gilbert's regimental comrade, who was now serving in the prefecture. Brustline went into his service, and although he had been unable to obtain a visa to travel to Spain, he now had the prefecture's stamp on his document. It was all that his comrade could do for him. Gilbert decided to go to Montpellier and buy a blank form of identity card there, so that he could have forged documents. This could be done at a centre for displaced persons, the senior at which turned out to be a former resident of Paris, a certain Zeglin. He recognized Gilbert from a photograph published in a newspaper, but did not extradite him to the authorities and advised him to sneak into Africa from Marseille. After arriving in Marseilles, Gilbert attempted to sail to Africa by steamboat. He stayed at a hotel, but when he returned to his room, he learned that there had been a theft in the hotel. The police began a search in all rooms, so Gilbert decided not to return to the hotel and went to Toulouse, expecting to formalize his departure to Spain. But even here he had no luck. In Toulouse, Gilbert got into a conversation with one of the locals. He told him all about himself. With this information, Gilbert went to the town hall and asked for a copy of his birth certificate to replace the one he had lost. At the police department, he was given a report on the loss of his ration card, which he converted into his father's authorization to voluntarily join the army. There was no way for him to go directly to London, so he hoped to go to Africa first, joining the army that had been established under the terms of the armistice. Gilbert now had official documents. He returned with them to Montpellier and joined the army, but after a week he was dismissed from service due to myopia. All this wandering was not in vain. At his discharge he was issued a genuine military ticket, and on this basis he received a legal identity card. In Montpellier, Gilbert's friend was acquainted with the Alsatian Teichlein, who moved to the southern zone to avoid forced mobilization into the German army. He was the head of a national mutual aid society here. Gilbert received 3,000 francs from him. Finally, Gilbert got the address of a café owner in Arun, near Saint-Jaap-de-Luz, who undertook to provide crossing the border. After many vicissitudes, Gilbert arrived at Saint-Jean-de-Luz. On his way to Arun, he met a young man with a tanned face and hands hardened by work, and asked him about the café. They walked side by side for a long time, but there was no conversation. At last the companion told him that the café was closed and that the guides had been arrested. Gilbert thanked him for his message, gave him a few bars of chocolate and packs of cigarettes. This touched the young man, and he invited Gilbert to his old house, where he lived with his 2 sisters and younger brother. The middle brother was at work in Spain. He himself was doing a bit of smuggling. With such a guide, crossing the border was not much trouble. In Spain, Gilbert found refuge with a Basque Catholic family who were extremely negative towards Francism. For a whole week, Gilbert was warmed by the heartfelt warmth of this family. At the English consulate in San Sebastian, he was given money to travel to Madrid. The English diplomats in Madrid met him very badly, and the same was repeated at the hotel recommended to him by the English. Gilbert had to spend the night in the ruins of the university campus, but he was not discouraged, remembering Colonel Jules Dumont and the glorious battles fought here by the international brigades. The next day the British met him as badly as the day before, nevertheless gave him money for a trip to Portugal. He set off, but at the station in Madrid he was followed by police agents. He was arrested and taken to prison. Interrogations began. "Are you French?" "No, I'm Canadian." "Then you're English?" "No, I'm Canadian. My name is Jean Vosy. I'm a Canadian citizen." Gilbert spent 4 months in prison in Torrijos. Then he was sent to Miranda, and from there he went to the English territory of Gibraltar. After that it was London and Algeria, and in 1944 Gilbert returned to France. 3 operations in Bordeaux, Nantes and Rouen marked the combat unity of the 3 pairs of the frontlines. Of course, the very name Special Organization still did not arouse enthusiasm among young people, but this was no longer essential, because the struggle was unfolding on a large scale. In order to put an end once and for all to the questions about the name of the organization, about which much and incorrectly written after the liberation, I, as well as others, think it necessary to specify that we adopted the name French Frontières. At the beginning of 1942, we decided to call our organization TP from now on. It is correct to add that the newspaper France Diable, published by the FCP in 1941 and early 1942, wrote in its subheading Information Organ of the French Patriot Movement for the Liberation of the Country, and in the large headline it read, "Our aim is the expulsion of the invaders." The January 1942 issue stated, "Among the forces of occupied Europe rising to fight for freedom are the French frontières, who have put forward the call France first." In April 1942, the organization was named the French Frontières et Partisans, but this was not a simple name change. The decision to do so had a far-reaching purpose. Before the creation of this association, to join the special organization, the battalions of youth or special groups of immigrant workers, and then the combined special organization and the special action organization, one had to be a member of the FCP. By deciding to create the French Frontières et Partisans, the FCP opened access to the organization to all those who wished to fight the occupiers without waiting for the problematic G-Day, thus making Foch's famous dictum on the principles of combat leadership of all the mistakes made. Only one is shameful inactivity. But to be fair, I must say in the words of Eugene Jenef that, despite this decision, there were few people willing to join the organization at that time. In 1942, some non-communists began to join us, but they were few. In 1943 and 1944, the number of members began to grow, and the French Frontières et Partisans was enlarged by patriots of various convictions. Some of its active members in 1943 and especially in 1944 were far from sharing the communist view of the future society, but they wanted to fight the occupiers with weapons in their hands and for this purpose joined the organization, which had already had combat units in its ranks since 1940. They knew that the leadership role here belonged to the communists. The men and women who fought in our ranks stated that from that time on they could no longer share the views of the anti-communists. They said so because they had joined their fate with the communists in the struggle for freedom and national independence. The constant threat of mortal danger forever fused our alliance. In October 1941, the leadership of the FCP established the first National Military Committee of the United Special Organization. Charles Thillon, a member of the underground leadership of the FCP, together with Jacques Duclos and Benoit Fracon, headed the command of the new organization. Colonel Dumont was appointed military commissioner, Georges Bayer was appointed armament commissioner. I was assigned the role of deputy political commissar. After the discovery of the laboratory by the police, on November 25, 1941, we were caught in a vise. On December 12th, agents of the special brigades of the police prefecture arrested Lucienne Pelouis, a nurse, an exemplary active communist, Jules Dumont's liaison, a grande dame who could not be disrespected, as everyone who knew her said. The next day, the same agents arrested Georges Fauveau, a veteran of the International Brigades and commissioner of the special organization in Anjou and Poitou. 3 days later, on December 15, 1941, the police set a trap in the same house and captured Pierre Ribaert, a combat associate of Georges Fauveau. The police were particularly active in tracking down Colonel Jules Dumont. After the failure of the laboratory, the arrest of Lucienne Pelouis, Fauveau and Pierre Ribaert, we decided in December 1941 to move Jules Dumont to the Green Apartment. For several months he lived in the Department of Oise and sent us excited letters, as the state of inactivity was unbearable for him. He was 53 years old, his body was stuffed with shell fragments and grenades, his lungs were poisoned by gases. But he kept saying, "I am strong and unbending." At the beginning of 1942, his persistent requests were granted. He became the military leader of the Valiant Frontier of Valiant Native Area of the departments of Nord and Pas-de-Calais. His political commissar was Julien Gapiot. His armament commissioner was Charles Debarge. Jules Dumont fell under the bullets of Nazi punishers on June 15, 1943. In his place, Georges Valette, former secretary of the Federation of the Garment Workers Union and an official of the Central Committee of the FCP, was appointed National Military Commissioner. Valette, also a veteran of the International Brigades, was wounded in the legs. His wounds had not yet healed when he was mobilized into the army in September 1939. He participated in the hostilities of 1939 to 1940. In early December 1941, he managed to escape from a prisoner of war camp near Berlin. He spent several days in the IV arrondissement of Paris, taking refuge in his parents' apartment. It was here that his ex-wife, who had retained a friendly feeling for him, visited him and helped him establish contact with the Communist Party. Living at his parents' was dangerous, and so Vallee rented a room at one of his friends, and then moved to the apartment of a teacher, Roland de Quilou, and his wife Suzanne in the ex-VII district of Paris. Vallee's contact was Angela Mercier, the wife of a communist, René Landrieu, who was in a German prisoner of war camp. She was not a communist, but sought to replace her husband during these difficult times. From 1940, together with Yvonne Vallee, she distributed leaflets and newspapers of the FCP. Under the pseudonym Nicole, she participated in the transportation of weapons. In conversations with Germaine, Cecile and Edwidge, Angela repeatedly expressed her fear that if she was arrested and beaten, she would talk. She was constantly haunted by fear when carrying out her assignments, but when agents of the special brigades of the police prefecture arrested her and subjected her to particularly sophisticated torture, she did not give anyone away, did not utter a word. Georges Vallee was an intelligent man. He could quickly assess the situation. For several months I had the opportunity to meet with him, as I did with Eugene Genaff, almost every week. In May 1942, he was appointed military commissar of the Paris district. The political commissar here was Roger Linet, the commissar for arms and intelligence Raymond Colin. Georges Vallee personally directed the actions of armed cover groups during the rallies on May 31, 1942 in the Rue de Bussy, where Madeleine Marzen spoke, and on August 1 in the Rue de Guerre, where Lisa Ricole spoke. He was arrested by agents of the special brigades, subjected to unheard-of torture, but did not extradite anyone. On July 3, 1943, he was shot. Georges Vallee's ex-wife Yvonne worked in the Paris underground organization since 1940. Under the leadership of André Brechet, she was engaged in the distribution of humanite and leaflets in the IV and V districts of Paris. Then, under the pseudonym of Amy Enon, she joined the company of the Frontiers under the command of Gaston Focadi. This was one of the most heroic companies of the Frontiers of the Paris district, consisting of 4 detachments. This unit of the Frontiers was in a special position. It reported directly to the Central Committee of the FCP. At the end of 1942, most of the company's men were arrested. By this time, the account of the company was about 40 operations conducted in the Paris area. The soldiers of the company eliminated 10 traitors, organized 5 explosions in movie theaters for German soldiers, conducted a sensational operation at the radio station in Saint. Assize let down 5 echelons and conducted a number of other operations. The men of this company alone killed several hundred soldiers, officers and non-commissioned officers of the occupying army in Paris. In police custody, the arrested fighters were subjected to unimaginable torture. Most died in concentration camps, and only a few returned from Mauthausen. Yvonne Vallée returned home in May 1945. Her body still bears the marks of the torture she endured in police stations when the blood dogs of the special brigades tried to get information from her about her ex-husband. Like Angela Mercier, she said nothing. The first meetings of the National Military Committee were held at Palaiseau, at the country house on the Rue de Paris, and then at Guichet-Orsay's and at Gif-sur-Yvette. At our first meeting we arrived with Eugene Geneuf. From the station at Palaiseau, the conductor took us by roundabout ways to a house on the Rue de Paris. For 24 hours we had to stay there, waiting for the other members of the committee to arrive. In April-May 1942, the National Military Committee of the organization French Frontières et Partisans consisted of Charles Thillon, a member of the underground leadership of the FCP, Commander Eugene Geneuf, National Political Commissar Albert Ouzoulias, National Military Commissar Georges Bayer, Commissioner of Arms and Intelligence. The composition of the committee remained unchanged until the end of the war, except for the replacement in May 1943 of Eugene Geneuf by René Camphin, whose brothers Maurice and Paul had been shot at Arras. The titles of the posts were changed. Political commissars were called commissars of personnel, military commissars were called commissars of operations, and their task was to organize reconnaissance and provide arms to the units. Marcel Preenan and Laurent Casanova also participated in the meetings of the National Military Committee. Professor Marcel Preenan was assigned to the National Military Committee to compile small works for military training and liaison with reserve officers. In addition, together with Georges Bayer, he liaised with other resistance organizations and with representatives of the British. The second participant in the meetings of the National Military Committee was Laurent Casanova. When the Consultative Assembly was established in 1943, we sent him to Algeria as our representative. He had previously edited the newspaper France d'Abord, which had become the organ of information, communication, and combat operations of the detachments of the Frontières and Partisans of Fighting France. In November 1943, he wrote a magnificent article on the armed uprising in Corsica, reminded of the traditions of honor and freedom of the inhabitants of this island. Anticipating the imminent departure of Laurent Casanova to Algeria, the newspaper France d'Abord noted that this article was written by Captain Casanova before his departure as a delegate of Frontiers and Partisans to work in the advisory committee established by the Committee for the National Liberation of France. But alas, 3 times Laurent Casanova arrived at the designated place to board the Allied plane that was to take him to Algeria, and 3 times the plane did not turn up. Casanova never made it there. He continued to cooperate in the newspaper, and in 1944 he was given a new specific task to create a patriotic militia. In the southern zone we had a local organ of the National Military Committee, the Zonal Military Committee. Georges Bayer kept in regular communication with him and informed us of the situation in the south on a monthly basis as soon as a delegate of the Zonal Military Committee arrived. We tried not to interfere directly with the leadership of the struggle in the southern zone. which unfolded at the end of 1943, and especially in 1944 on a large scale. We must not forget that this zone was occupied by the German army only on November 11, 1942. The resistance in it had its own peculiarities in comparison with the northern zone during this period. In the northern zone, each of us lived the fighting in all interregions, and we received almost daily detailed information about the struggle. From the southern zone, we received only generalized data on the situation. Although German troops occupied the southern zone only on November 11, 1942, there was already a resistance movement there before that. For example, comrades Samson and Paul Estive managed to commit a major sabotage at the power plant that supplied energy to the foundry in Montjean, which produced cylinder heads for aircraft engines. Under the leadership of Pierre Duaz, Jean Robert, Bernard Feiter, Etienne Dale and Pierre Gomez carried out in the Department of Guerre a series of sabotage in industrial enterprises in the service of the Germans, defeated the board of a pro-Nazi organization. Pierre Duaz was arrested on September 30, 1942, after smashing an advertising window of the French People's Party board in Nimes. Despite the repression that began, Jean Robert's group organized a sabotage at a factory in Béziers. As Nazi troops entered the unoccupied zone on November 11, 1942, a powerful demonstration was held in the city of Nimes. It was an expression of the will of the population of the Department of Guerre to resist the occupiers. Jean Robert and his comrades organized the explosion of transformers on the railroad, which delayed the arrival of trains with German troops. On February 3, 1943, Vincent Feiter, who had escaped from the Mozac camp, joined Jean Robert and his brother Bernard Feiter. On February 20, 1943, the three comrades planted a suitcase of explosives in a special house designed to house German officers. 5 Nazis were killed, and about 10 wounded. Unfortunately, of all the reports received by the National Military Committee from the Southern Zone, I particularly remember a report received one day in 1943 about the deaths of 2 young and valiant fighters, Jean Robert and Vincent Feiter. Vincent Feiter was arrested a second time on March 6th. Jean Robert and his group made a desperate attempt to free Vincent as he was being transported from one prison to another. Whether due to a leak or for some other reason, Jean Robert was arrested before this operation could even begin. On March 23, 1943, the Pétain-appointed judges of the Special Court in Nimes sentenced Jean Robert and Vincent Feiter to death. This was done on Pétain's orders, and I repeat once again that it was on his orders that the death sentence was imposed. The decisive intervention of the lawyers Delran and Bidault proved useless. The sentence had been determined before the trial, and the patriots had to deal not with the judges but with the executioners. The so-called Marshal of France was against the army to engage the Germans on November 11, 1942. He had no qualms about deciding the fate of the French. Just as he had done in August and September 1941 in the Northern Zone, here too the French guillotine was added to the Nazi gallows. I am a member of the French Communist Party. Jean Robert told the Judge Palace, "I am a soldier of the fatherland. Everything I have done as a patriot fighting against the enslavement of the country by the invaders and the traitors who serve them. I do not regret anything, and if I do, it is only that I could not do more." On April 22, 1943, Jean Robert and Vincent Feiter were guillotined. Pierre Duaz was at this time in prison in Nimes. Recounting this day, he writes, "As soon as Louis Gazania spoke, all the prisoners gathered together. Louis said, 'Please observe a minute's silence in memory of Jean Robert and Vincent Feiter, who heroically fell for France.' All the prisoners stood up. Never before had the paying of honours been done in a more moving atmosphere. It took place at a moment when the blood of the patriots Jean Robert and Vincent Feiter had not yet had time to cool. I was very saddened by the fact that Eugene Genoff, for whom I had a deep respect, dropped out of the National Military Committee in May 1943. We were strongly united by the hardships we had to endure in August, and September 1941. I liked Eugene Genough's concern for man, for people, his very great cordiality. I was always struck by this worker-builder's analytical mind, fighting spirit forged in the crucible of labour struggle. Eugene Genough devoted his whole life to the struggle of workers and work in trade union organisations. It is often forgotten to mention the role he played in the deployment of the frontlines as National Political Commissar, a post he held from August 1941 to May 1943. I believe that this constitutes his greatest merit in the overall struggle during the occupation. He had to work under the most difficult conditions. During our meeting in August 1941, we insisted on the necessity of carrying out the first operations directly against the officers and soldiers occupying our country. I remember how Eugene advocated the use of simple methods of extracting weapons from officers. A former construction worker, he expressed his thoughts in easily accessible language, and this helped to find mass forms of daily struggle. I had to watch him rush from one suburb to another, from one meeting to another, and this at a time when the Paris district was the place where the main forces of the suppression apparatus were gathered, where the police methods of the chiefs of the German Gestapo and the leaders of the French police prefecture were widely combined. From the middle of 1942, every person leaving the subway was monitored, and if two people walked together, they were immediately followed by police surveillance, even if in 9 cases out of 10 these people had nothing to do with the resistance. So, as political commissar, Eugene Genough had to convince our comrades of the necessity of waging an armed struggle and implementing the decisions of the party leadership to include many activists in the groups of the frontlines. In due time, history will have its say on the major role played by Eugene Genough during the years of the resistance. Eugene Genough went through a difficult school of life. Born in 1904 in Spiez, he moved to Paris with his parents. After the outbreak of war, he returned to his native village, where he was hired as a labourer on a farm for 5 francs a month and a pair of wooden shoes a year. After the end of the war, he came back to Paris and started working in a printing shop. The family struggled to make ends meet. He learned a trade and soon became a cement worker at a construction company. A little time passed, and he joined the labour struggle. In 1924, he joined the Unitarian General Confederation of Labour, and a little later in the French Communist Party. He loved his profession, was a good worker, but this did not prevent him from leading the struggle for higher wages and better working conditions. He proved himself positive in all respects, and his comrades soon elected him General Secretary of the Cement Workers' Union, and then Regional Secretary of the Construction Workers' Union and Secretary of the Unitary General Confederation of Labour, an association of Parisian unions. As he struggled to achieve his immediate goals, he never lost sight of the threat that increasingly loomed over the world war and fascism. In 1932, as part of a delegation of workers from the Paris district, he participated in the Amsterdam Anti-War Congress, which established the Committee of Unity and Struggle Against Fascism and War. He distinguished himself by leading Parisian workers in mass demonstrations on February 6, 9 and 12, 1934, when there were clashes with fascists and police. These demonstrations ended on February 12 with a general strike called by 2 trade union centres. In 1936, at the Joint Congress of the General Confederation of Labour and the Unitarian General Confederation of Labour, Eugene was elected to the Administrative Commission of the newly formed large organisation, which took the name General Confederation of Labour. A member of the Central Committee of the PCF, he led the Regional Association of Parisian Trade Unions together with Henry Reynaud and other trade unionists. In this position he dealt with a variety of issues and workers' affairs in a wide variety of industries. Among the seamstresses, the cement worker met Germaine, who became the companion of his life. In the difficult hours of life, and Eugene would have many of them, she helped him with all her devotion. During the occupation, she was an indispensable liaison. That's what Eugene Genough was. Not only did he have to use a fake ID, but he had to take care not to be recognized. Small moustache and glasses with thick glasses poorly disguised the former head of the Parisian trade unions. Eugene Januf lived in Clamart. In addition to the city apartment, he rented a country house in Chaville, where we met regularly. It was in this house that one January day in 1942, despite all the difficulties of the time, when death was constantly hovering over us, we relaxed for an entire Sunday. Eugene and Germaine invited me and Cécile. Eugene was the soul of the society, a merrymaker and an amusement, peppered the meal with witticisms and jokes. In the afternoon we talked about this and that. It was very cold outside. The sun shone pale but bright, its rays penetrated into the room through the glass doors. Suddenly he said, "Here comes the new year." The past one was difficult. Now special organization groups are fighting almost everywhere. We have a small army. We need a song that our fighters can sing, as they did in the year 1792. After that, Eugene Januf, together with Germaine, sang the song of the frontlines for the first time. Eugene wrote the words for it, and Jean Chaplin composed the music to them. The Song of the Partisans, composed by Maurice Drouin, is now well known. It was written later in London. It was sung after the liberation. This song is very good. You can't listen to it without excitement. But we also cherish another song, Born in the Underground, in the heart of the deep night of occupied France. It sounded powerfully among the women prisoners of the Rhine prison, led by Bertha Vivian, in the Rocket prison with Simone Chaplin, in other prisons and concentration camps, and was sung by many resistance fighters. This song lives in us. It is the song of our hopes. It is a historical document that tells us that French communists draw their strength from national sources, that they have only one goal to fight to win back the freedom of their homeland. Let those who, decades later, read this text again try to imagine themselves in a France enslaved by Nazi soldiers, helped in every possible way by Vichy traitors, in a France where they were killed, shot, guillotined on a daily basis. And I am sure that many will appreciate these poems not only from a literary point of view, but also as a song of hope, a song of struggle, the song of the frontiers. France has always set an example. When the barricades stood up, when for holy liberty, her sons died. The time has come to fight the enemy again. Fight. Who will not bow his head low? Once again, under the boots of the forged, our sweet France groans. Chorus. The motto of the French people. Either death in battle or liberty. We'll give our lives for you, mother country. We're ready to give our lives. Hear, friend, the sound of swords ringing out. It's our ancestors calling us to battle. Only the brave can win, Idus. Only the strong in battle win. My France, my generous homeland, you will not surrender to the mercy of your enemies. You're a source of mighty power. You'll be a source of strength to your sons. Chorus, we will not let the corrupt creatures turn us into despicable slaves. Freedom will be won by the brave. We'll defend our country. We'll break the chains of steel. No more slavery for our country. And France will shine again, and liberty and bright brotherhood. Chorus. In 1943, in the Paris district, repression intensified, and therefore it was necessary to take additional measures to avoid arrests. The party leadership decided to create armed guards to escort and provide cover for the most prominent activists. Eugene Januf was included among the guards. Eugene suggested that a chauffeur be brought in to do the job. Fortunately, those who were in charge of human resources at our company were aware of this man's questionable behavior and connections. It turned out that his wife's brother, a policeman, was clearly anti-communist. Eugene Januf was forced to change his apartment urgently and to observe a regime of isolation. At the last meeting, Edwidge, Cécile and I learned that Germaine and Eugene were connected with the underground organization only through us. we were faced with two contradictory problems. On the one hand, we had to ensure the security of the National Military Committee, and on the other hand, we had to prevent the arrest of Eugene, Jennifer, and Jermaine, who were left without money or ration cards. The situation became even more dramatic when Simone and Jean Chaplin were arrested. The logging couple in the Croissy Forest were also imprisoned, and we had held several meetings there. In serious conversations on the subject, Edwidge insisted that we keep in touch with Eugene and his wife. It was Edwidge who went to Jermaine Jenneff's house every 2 weeks and brought her ration cards and money. Edwidge carried out her difficult duties as liaison to the military committee, at the same time substituting mother to young girls who had not seen their mothers. Claire, a small 18-year-old Breton girl, told me that Edwidge brought her a little sugar every time. For a while, Jermaine and Eugene hid in Livry Gargain with an Italian anti-fascist who put a garden house at their disposal. Then it turned out that the man whom Eugene was going to make his bodyguard, and whom our personal authorities had rejected, knew the owner of the house. This forced Jermaine and Eugene to change apartments. A wine wholesaler in Livry Gargain found them a safe haven in Montfermeil with a bicycle dealer. When it was decided to send Eugene Jenneff to work in the Southern Zone, and the question of how to find him came up, I said I could do it in a relatively short time. Eugene and Jermaine left for the Southern Zone, and before that they had to endure the most difficult weeks of their lives in every respect. From October 1941, we began to put together groups of francs-tireurs in each interregion, then in the departments, and in all 9 sectors of the Paris area. Wherever possible, headquarters were set up everywhere. The Communist Party leadership ordered a broader recruitment of cadres for the armed organization, which was being set up on voluntary principles, through extensive awareness raising. At the same time, work was underway to create a national front. All our party documents indicate that 10 and then 20% of the entire FCP participated in the fighting of the Francs-tireurs. Here I feel it necessary to pay tribute to Félix Cadre and Arthur Dallider and their successors Jean Lafitte and Robert Dubois for the great help they gave us. In the Paris area, Arthur and Félix placed at our disposal in October 1941 such outstanding people as Yves Kermain and Louis Marchandise. A native of Vitry, Louis Marchandise had joined the FCP in 1936, had been in an illegal situation since 1940, and was in charge of the newspaper Humanite until January 1941. In January 1941, he became responsible for mass work in the entire southern suburbs of the capital. In May 1941, he was entrusted with the leadership of the committees of the National Front that was being created. Great hopes for the success of our cause in the trade unions were linked to a prominent representative of the labour movement, Yves Kermain. A native of Brittany, he, like many others, had to leave at a young age his native commune of Calac in the department of Côtes-d'Or, nor to seek work in Paris. Here he entered the Renault factory. At that time, in this factory, the trade union movement was captive to a system of denunciation and repression. It was extremely difficult to carry out work in these conditions, not without reason that the democratic newspapers often referred to the penal servitude of Renault. In such an environment, the trade union struggle was a good school for the underground. In those years, our party called on the best activists of the labour movement to leave the small factories, where unions were respected, where the wages were suitable, and to take jobs in the Renault factories. They had to accept the loss of part of their earnings, and sometimes even change their names. Coming from Brittany, Yves joined the struggle, and went through a good school of class struggle. In 1935, he joined the FCP. Yves Kermain's energy and organizational skills soon made him a favorite of the workers. He was always there when it was necessary to defend his brothers in labor, did not accept any favors, rejected class reconciliation in any form with disgust, created a large group of workers' delegates, did not give peace to the directorate. Yves Kermain was unanimously elected to the leadership of the union. For him, as for many others, 1936 was a year of accumulating experience, brought the first successes and inspired hope in the hearts of the working people. Then in Boulogne, the metal worker Alfred Costa was elected deputy. It is only now that the young metal workers of the Renault factories vote for the communists on open lists of candidates for deputy, but in those years there was no such possibility. Much of the credit for the changes that took place goes to Yves Kerman. Like Louis Marchandise, he had been in responsible positions in the propaganda organs of the FCP since 1940. I had to meet with Yves Kerman regularly, often several times a week. We studied each cell that made up the sectors of the Paris district. The unification was already complete, but it was the veterans of the battalions of youth who, at 7 o'clock in the morning of November 21st, 1941, organized the bombing of a Nazi bookseller's establishment, thus marking the unification of the patriotic forces. The decision to carry out this operation was made by us together with Fabian. For a month and a half, this Nazi enterprise had been carrying out unbridled propaganda. It was part of a German institute created by the Nazis with the prospect of Germanizing the University of Paris and our entire educational system. In the premises of the enterprise hung a portrait of Hitler, books glorifying racism, fascism, anti-communism, and the works of Rosenberg and other theoreticians of Nazism were displayed. There were also maps that misrepresented the situation on the Eastern Front and the history of our country. The diversion was supposed to be timed to coincide with the beginning of the school year, but this was not possible. Albert Gesgen, who was supposed to bring the bombs, did not show up at the appointed hour. His alarm clock failed him. And on November 21st, 1941, the operation was carried out in an exemplary manner. Louis Coquier masterfully directed its entire course. Two groups of fighters' battalions of youth took up a position near the bookseller's enterprise. First, they smashed the shop window with cobblestones, and then 2 bombs were thrown inside the premises. The policeman guarding the business ran away. The next day, the target looked as if it had been bombed. Albert Gesgen had spared no explosives. Police cordons could not contain the thousands of people who came to see the work of our frontiers. Operations both in Paris itself and in its suburbs were carried out with increasing frequency. On November 22, 1941, the frontiers threw grenades at a German military hotel. This operation was led by Tardif and Giraud, and there were many dead and wounded. About 8 o'clock in the evening of November 26th, Guy Gaultier, Drouot, and Garot attacked a German guard post near the Orleans Gate. The same evening, the Patriots threw grenades at a German hotel in the XVII arrondissement of Paris. 2 Nazi soldiers were killed. December 2nd, Louis Coquier and Marcel Baudaria, under the leadership of Fabian, organized an explosion in the premises of the National People's Association on the Boulevard Blanqui. On the same day, the inseparable Maurice Feld and Maurice Ferme slew a Nazi officer on the Boulevard de la Magenta. Under our blows, the Nazi repression went down. On December 3rd, Pierre Tourette and his brother Paul, together with Gerard Gilsum, attacked Nazi Major Fritz Fries on the Rue de la Seine. The Nazi was seriously wounded. Gerard managed to take refuge with a second-hand shop owner and wait out a few hours while the Nazis searched most zealously for the attackers. December 5th and 6th, the Soviet army went on the offensive on a front 800 kilometers wide, and at this difficult moment for Germany we undertook a massacre of Nazi officers. On Pereira Boulevard, Louis Coquier shot Lieutenant Rahl. In the non-commissioned officers' club of the German army, many occupiers were destroyed and wounded by grenades. It was on December 7th, 1941, when Hitler's troops began their retreat near Moscow, and we intensified our operations, that high-ranking Parisian figures, members of the Bureau of the Municipal and General Councils, cardinals, academicians, appealed to Parisians to turn themselves into denouncers, to publicly condemn the actions of the patriots. This document can be seen in the archives of the Council of Paris and in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Some of the signatories assure that they were never consulted on this matter, and that they only learned of the existence of this document after it had been published. But they had many ways and means at their disposal to expose the fraud at once. The struggle for their honor was fraught with the danger of loss of personal wealth, and perhaps with the necessity of going into hiding. But no, none of these men did so. Times were hard as the great saint. Justly asserted a century and a half ago, for those who dreaded the grave. At 8:30 on the evening of December 15th, Louis Coquillier and Marcel Bauderia threw a bomb into the office of the Field Gendarmerie, located in the Hotel Universel. On December 18th, Marcel Borton and Louis Coquille set fire to German vehicles en Rue Meyrand. A report to the German command from the French police service stated, "Soldiers spotted the arsonists and opened fire on them. Police officers Barbeau, Plaire, and Hugo were on duty nearby. They saw the soldiers chasing a man, but the man shot back and escaped. The police immediately went in search of him, and at number 39 in the Rue Faubourg Montmartre stopped a passerby, who in appearance was similar to the one pursued by the soldiers. The detainee took advantage of some confusion on the part of the police and ran away. The policeman fired at him. Hugo fired 2 shots from his pistol. Pla fired 1 shot. Leloup and Corbin joined the fleeing police officers in the street. Hugo reported his actions by telephone to the central post. The policeman approached house number 26 on Rue Cadet and learned from the gatekeeper that an unknown man had just entered the house. Barbeau began to examine one of the wings of the house, at which time a 5th-floor tenant called police officers Pla and Corbin to report that some unknown person had gotten into an argument with her husband outside her apartment. The unknown person was apprehended. He turned out to be one Marcel Burton, born in 1920, a former political commissar of the International Brigades, a member of the Central Committee of the Union of Communist Youth, from October 1939, was in Chibron internment camp and escaped from there in October 1940. After receiving a telephone message from Hugo, Chief Inspector Blondeau and his colleague Denoise arrived on the scene, ordered the blocking of Rue Cadet and a search of the entire house. Chief Commissioner Charles Dubellon, Divisional Commissioner Silvestre, Chief Commissioner Weber, the Chief of the Special Brigade and German Major Weigert were present at the arrest. At 0 HR, 35 Min, Marcel Burton was taken to the Field Gendarmerie. On April 15, 1942, a German military tribunal sentenced Marcel Burton and 24 other comrades from the Special Organization and the Youth Battalions to death. On April 17, Burton was shot. In a letter to his daughter he wrote, "One must possess the spirit of self-sacrifice for a noble, just cause. Let you not be deterred by motives that may seem to convince you that your sacrifice is in vain, useless. Do not be ashamed that your father was shot." Such words of a patriot are an omen of the terrible time we were living through. In the following years, not a single member of the resistance wrote such a letter. Everyone knew that the people considered him and his comrades to be the best sons of France, heroes who had fallen in the great battle of the nations. And in 1941 and early 1942, our fighters had to reckon with the fact that many Frenchmen, like the tenants from the Rue Cadet, held a different opinion at that time. Don't be ashamed that your father was shot. How much heroism on the one hand, and how much sorrow on the other, in these simple words. And how diligent were the French policemen, who surely knew that if the Germans were chasing a Frenchman, it was surely a patriot. Unfortunately, the majority of policemen in 1941, 1942, 1943, and early 1944 were of this opinion, and the courage and pride of a small handful of them, who served the resistance, and thus France, despite the threat of being imprisoned in death camps in the clutches of the punishers, must be applauded. The arrest and execution of Marcel Burton was the hardest blow to me. I loved him like a brother, but he did not know that I was the leader of his commander Yves Kerman, and that we could not see each other. Whatever it cost me, I did not want to meet him, but I was always interested in him. I remember when, at the end of 1938, he came to the premises of the Union of Communist Youth of the Ronan district. He was 18 years old at the time. He had just returned from Spain, covered with wounds that had not yet healed, but literally the day after his arrival he approached us. I spoke to him briefly, and the next day we brought him into the regional secretariat. When I was mobilized into the army in March 1939, he was assigned my duties in the regional leadership. I talked about him with Raymond Goyette, chairman of the Union of Communist Youth, and other comrades. We decided to nominate him to the Central Committee, to which he was elected at the Congress in Issy-les-Moulineaux, together with Fabien and Marcel Pemnot. The winter of 1941/42 was difficult in every respect. The Gestapo and the occupation authorities took increasingly severe measures against the actions of the frontlines, which now encompassed the whole of occupied France. Truly difficult times were coming for the invincible German army on the Soviet front, and the anxiety of the race of gentlemen for its affairs in all occupied countries, particularly in France, was growing. On December 5 and 6, 1941, Soviet troops went on the offensive near Moscow. On the 800-kilometer front, they deepened in some places to 300 kilometers. In his diary, General Gulder wrote that on July 31st the German losses amounted to 213,000, on November 13th 700,000, on November 26th 743,000 people, that is, 24% of the troops put into battle. The Nazi command in France ordered the destruction of the frontlines, which in 6 months turned the entire country into a battlefront. A new wave of terror began, and on December 15th, 100 patriots were shot, and Gabriel Péry was among them. The arrests became particularly frequent in January and February 1942. They were the result of failure to observe the rules of conspiracy in the face of increased surveillance. We already know how Fernand Zolkinov and members of the group from District XI were arrested. On March 4, 1942, the German military tribunal began its sessions in the conference room of the Chamber of Deputies. This was done in order to have a psychological effect on our 7 friends on trial. The chained defendants were led into the gleaming gold, luxurious hall filled with officers in dress uniforms. For a whole day this trial continued, the course of which was recorded on motion picture film. The Nazis never dared to show this movie on the screens. The trial of the 7 shackled men turned into a trial not of them, but of those who put these shackles on the defendants and on the whole of France. The collaborationist press published the materials of the trial, but from them only the courageous behavior of our glorious comrades in arms at the trial became evident. One of the defendants, Robert Peltier, declared that he had acted as a patriot, as a convinced communist. The president of the court-martial, a Nazi officer, stated that the threat of execution did not shake the defendant for a second, and the newspaper Paris Zeitung ended its report with these words: "The German military court notes with satisfaction the invaluable assistance of the French police. The presence of German troops created favorable conditions for the police to detect and arrest the communists." The president of the court clearly internalized Field Marshal Keitel's directives. On March 9, 1942, in a stunning letter to his parents, Fernand Zolkinov wrote, "A few hours will pass, and I will no longer be in this world. I am completely calm, waiting for this moment without mental excitement. I am convinced that I am not giving my life in vain. I am sure that the time will come when people will live in joy and love." Who wrote these lines was only 18 years old. On February 11, 1942, Yves Kermain was to meet Franz Bloch on the platform of the metro station Quai de la Rape. When he arrived at the meeting place, he saw Franz fighting off the police officers who were trying to arrest him. Without the slightest hesitation, Yves shot at the policeman and enabled Franz to jump onto the departing train and thus avoid arrest. Yves himself was arrested. Before his arrest, Fabien and I visited the site of the planned operations. The plan was to blow up the Lido nightclub, where Nazi officers were drinking, and also the anti-Bolshevik exhibition opening on March 1st in the Wagram Hall. Our purpose was to decide how best to proceed, since Yves, Kermain and Fabian, who was in charge of the operation at the Wagram Hall, disagreed. Fabian suggested that one of the frontiers should discreetly leave a suitcase containing an explosive device in the hall, while Yves Kerman thought it would be better to throw 2 or 3 grenades into the hall. Preliminary reconnaissance showed that the hall was guarded by the police, and it would be difficult to bring the suitcase with the explosive device into the hall. There would be a lot of trouble in ensuring the safety of our glorious fighters. That's why I personally favoured Yves Kermain's suggestions. After Yves Kermain's arrest, Fabian began to put his plan into action. Time was rushing, the exhibition had been in operation since March 1st and action had to be taken. The operation was scheduled for March 8th. André Kirschen, the youngest of us in age, took a large suitcase of dirty laundry, came to the exhibition with it, and after a while went out without any complications. Our friends probably wished to ascertain whether the contents of the suitcase would be inspected. Georges Tondelier and the young German anti-fascist Karl Schönhaar concluded that the way was clear, but one thing they did not take into account was that André went in and out with the suitcase. That same morning, Tondelier and Schönhaar, having stowed a time bomb in the suitcase, easily walked with it to the Wagram Hall and left the suitcase in the restroom. The policeman apparently remembered that they entered the room with the suitcase and returned without it. The friends were called out by a policeman. "Wait, young people. You forgot your suitcase." Tondelier and Schönhaar were embarrassed and tried to run away. They were apprehended. The hidden suitcase was discovered a few minutes before the explosion. André Kirschen, confident that the operation was a success, in the afternoon went to the Tuileries garden to meet Tondelier, and there the police were already waiting for him. Sessions of the military tribunal, held in the Chamber of Deputies since April 15, 1942, were held in the House of Chemistry. Here was held the trial of 10 of our senior comrades, among whom were Simone Schloss and Marie-Therese Lefebvre. 9 people were sentenced to death, including Yves Kerman. He was as steadfast during the trial as he had been in the armed struggle in which he had participated. Together with 10 older patriots, 16 men from the battalions of youth were tried, as well as a friend of Charles Schönhaar, the gatekeeper Pierre Leblois, who hid the weapons of the group. Only André Kirschen, barely 16 years old, was not condemned to death. How were our comrades arrested? We already know the circumstances of Yves Kerman's arrest, but we know nothing about why they tried to detain Franz Bloch. With regard to Marcel Bertin, we have German and French documentary data. In addition to these comrades, at the same time Félix Cadre, Arthur Delide, Georges and Marie Politzer, Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, Jacques Solomon, André Pican and Danielle Casanova, so dear to me, were detained. 100 active patriots fell at the hands of the Nazi executioners. They must have been under surveillance for a long time. Robert Dubois replaced Arthur Delide. Jean Lafitte, Jacques Duclos's former secretary, took over from Félix Cadre. If it was very difficult to find replacements for valuable cadres with extensive practical experience, then at no other time than during the resistance could Karl Marx's famous maxim that conditions affect people as much as people affect those conditions have been put to the test. The struggle continued. On the morning of the day of Marcel Bertin's arrest, Tondelier threw a bomb into a German garage on the Rue d'El-Université. The resulting explosion almost completely burned all the cars and the building itself. On December 23rd, Lebas and Tourette cut 3 German communication lines in the vicinity of Radio Grigny. The end of 1941 was marked by an attack on the boardroom of a Nazi organization and the disruption of communication lines at Le Bourget Airport. On January 20th, 1942, Giraud, Orbouet and Tardif killed a Nazi officer at the intersection near the boulevards Pasteur and Vaugirard. On January 28th, Jean Carr and Roger Debret threw a bomb into a canteen for German officers at the intersection of Montmartre and Chateaudun streets. On February 1st, Roger Debret and Charles Schoenhaar blew up and burned 5 German trucks on Rue Royale with 5 grenades. On February 5th, Tondelier, Tardif and Guy Gaultier attacked a Wehrmacht special house. They planted a time bomb under an awning. The blast wave threw another bomb inside the building, and there it went off. At 2 hours and 30 minutes in the afternoon on February 22nd, Roger Debret together with Tondelier detonated a large bomb in the parking lot of German vehicles on the street near the Cinema Gaumont. Several dozen trucks were destroyed. In February and early March, many activists were arrested, and we were in a difficult position. We had to build up our strikes so that the police would not realize that our best fighters had been captured. Henry Tanguy, the future Colonel Roll, joined the organization. He took over the work done by Yves Kermain and Louis Marchandise. For a while he was in charge of all our activities. I remember in March 1942, and in particular at a meeting outside the military academy, in a café at the intersection of avenues Tour Maubourg and Mott Piquet, we discussed our situation. We had a slogan at that time: create an organization by fighting and fight by creating an organization. It was necessary to restore the leadership of all 9 sectors, to organize the actions of all the forces then available, so that the special brigades would not think that our organization had been decapitated. Henry was a punctilious man who liked to keep a record of everything he did. He kept small forms that reflected the state of our organizations, which were under constant attack from the special brigades and the Gestapo. We had to work hard at the beginning of 1942. In April, the party sent such worthy men as Raymond Lasserand and Gaston Cara to lead the Paris district. Baissa Duanve became armament commissioner. In addition to them, Henry Tanguy became a member of the staff. Raymond Lasserand had all the qualities of a leader of the masses. He was able to carry people along, was an optimist, able to convey to people his faith in communism and in the victory over Nazism. Major Gaston Cara was a model of poise, which captivated me every time we met. He was an unbending man, an officer new to the new struggle. When required, he personally participated in operations, served as an example to others, and never relied on chance. Baissa proved to be among the best commissioners of arms in all the interregions. After their arrest, the 3 patriots were subjected to brutal torture, but even in prison they behaved as in battle. They were admired by all the prisoners. At the beginning of 1942, their rise to leadership caused an unprecedented scale of armed struggle. Next to them fought glorious men whom they had drawn into the struggle themselves, or those who came to us after the party had introduced the principle of manning the frontier organizations from among volunteers. I remember the leader of our strike groups, Paul Thieret, who was arrested on May 18th. He was subjected to terrible torture, but he did not utter a word. In a letter to his wife he wrote, "For almost 5 hours 3 policemen beat me. During the last interrogation I had my right eye knocked out with a hammer. In spite of everything, I did not say a word. A month later I still had marks of the beatings. I can't say how many times I lost consciousness." After the arrest of these heroes, they were succeeded by Roger Linet, Georges Valley and Raymond Collin. Henry Tanguy, who had narrowly escaped arrest, was appointed political commissar for the interregion of Vendée, Deux-Sèvres, Meun and Loire, as it was dangerous for him to remain in the Paris region. In the Paris district, such valiant men as members of the Central Committee of the Union of Communist Youth, Jean Gemin, Ancella, Guy Gaultier, Maurice Lebert, Rousseau, Fongano, Claude, Sevy, Van der Heyden, Roger Leroy, Jean-Charles Schmidt, and my brother-in-law Raymond Rummegan, who became Roger Linet's deputy, continued to fight under the leadership of Roger Linet. In April 1942, the party leadership created the French Frontières et Partisans, opening access to our organization to anyone willing to fight the occupiers without waiting for an indefinite G-Day. Frontlines et partisans. What an inspiration these words evoke. We decided to create the first group of partisans, our first maquis in the northern zone, our brander of the entire Paris district, which would begin to strike the enemy daily. But Fabien was no longer among us. When he miraculously escaped arrest and a bounty was placed on his head, Fabien went to Dukes and led the group operating there. During another raid on November 30th, 1942, he was arrested at the Republic subway station. This happened on the eve of the day I was to set him up in one of our underground clinics. At the head of our Calvert camp in the Mont-Saint-Louis area was my combat comrade in arms, Maurice Lebert. Jean Rosignoa, a former doctor of the battalions of the Young, became the doctor of this camp. In addition to them, there were Pierre Benoit, who had gone illegal and often conducted operations with 4 of his comrades, an old friend of Maurice Lebert, a member of the Union of Communist Youth of Alphaville, Albert Manuel, André Pellet, André Belly, André Boissiers, Pulikin Hillet, Bossier, Beauclerc, Gourmelin, as well as 3 liaisons, Daniel George's wife Raymond, Maurice Lebert's wives Simone Deguerre and Paulette Gourmelin. The operations followed one after another. On April 26, 1942, our comrades derailed a freight train near Bretigny. On May 2nd, they blew up and burned a German warehouse at the Orleans Gate. On May 10th, Pierre Benoit and his friends killed a Nazi officer in the Rue Armorique, not far from where another officer was shot down on January 20th. This time the shooter was Lucien Legros. On the same day, May 10th, Rousseau, Roger Debret, and B. blew up the telephone exchange of the Ministry of Communications on Rue Grenelle. Rousseau kept in constant communication between Paris headquarters and the guerrilla group, while Roger Linet and Georges Valley occasionally met with them. On May 20th, Pierre Benoit and young Lycée members attacked the patrol ship Vega, which was carrying Nazi officers. On May 29th, Maurice Lebert carried out a sensational operation. We learned from his people in the police prefecture that agents of special brigades after interrogation and torture of patriots often come to the cafés on the Boulevard des Palais. Roger Debret quickly made a suitcase filled with explosives and shrapnel according to the rules of art. In every detail thought out the system of the fuse in the form of an electric battery and an alarm clock, whose small hand at a certain time was to close the contact inside and produce an explosion. At 11 o'clock, Maurice Lebert and B. came to the café as if to drink an apéritif, carelessly put the suitcase under the table, stood for a while, paid and quietly went out into the street. Roger Debret and Rousseau were nearby, ready to assist and cover those who were carrying out the task. The owner of the café noticed that our friends had left their suitcase, came to the threshold and called out to those who were leaving, who were already turning the corner of Rue Lutetia. Later, Maurice Lebert told me that they heard the café owner calling them, but did not turn around but slightly quickened their steps. Simone Deguerre and Raymond Georges were watching everything that was going on. They noticed that the owner, complaining that he was not heard, took the suitcase and put it behind the counter, apparently believing that the owners would return. Soon many agents of the special brigades, experts in anthropometry and interrogation with partiality, were gathered in the café. No doubt these men were pleased with their morning's accomplishments. A violent explosion was heard at exactly the right time, when the café was full. The counter was blown to small pieces, and the sound of the explosion was heard throughout the entire block. The shrapnel killed and wounded many agents of the special brigades. A large piece of shrapnel broke through the ceiling and flew into the upstairs office of the prefect of police, just where the chair had been. The prefect himself, unfortunately, was not present. We did not learn that there was a prefect's office in this building until the next day, when the collaborationist press reported about the failed attempt on the life of the police prefect. A guerrilla group from the Calvert camp in the Mont-Saint-Louis area had been fighting for several months. It was the very first guerrilla unit made up of the very best fighters of the Paris district. At the time of its formation, there was no shortage of willing members from among the men who had evaded conscription. Maurice Lebert commanded the detachment. On April 27th, partisans under the command of Roger Debret and Rousseau threw grenades at a German detachment near the Villette outpost. On May 31st, the Union of French Women and the Communists organized a large demonstration in the Rue de Bussy. It was held to launch a popular movement against the reduction of food rations. Hundreds of people gathered in the Rue de Bussy in front of a large store. Madeleine Marsan made a speech. She called on housewives to fight against the food policies of the Germans and the Vichyists, then said, "Take everything you need." The housewives began to take the food. The police intervened, but Guy Gaultier, Latany, Benoit, Grelot and cover groups, led by the military commissioner of the Paris district, Georges Vallee, joined the fight, opened fire on the police who tried to arrest the demonstrators. After police reinforcements arrived, the guerrillas withdrew, but Madeleine Marsan, Delmas and several other comrades were arrested. They were sentenced to death. Madeleine Marsan managed to escape and continued the struggle. Whereas before we had solved some problems with great difficulty, because of the political campaign against us, now conditions were more favorable. We attacked town halls, took away cards to provide food for fighters and comrades who were in an illegal situation. On June 26th, Maurice Lebert, Rousseau, B. and Marcel Dean of the Oise department seized all the ration cards in Nogent and Oise on July 3rd. Debret, Rousseau, Boissière and B. did the same in Pantin, and on July 27th, it was the turn of Bretigny-sur Orge and Champagne-sur-Seine. At the same time, a group from Mont-sur-Loing carried out an act of retaliation against the General Secretary of the French People's Party, the traitor Gachelin, who lived at Olenville. Numerous diversions were carried out on the railroads on July 5th, between Auzois-la-Ferrière and Gretz on July 13th, near Malzaba on July 15th, between Bois-le-Roi and Fontaine-le-Port on July 20th, between Barrate and Lardy on August 7th, between Bois-le-Roi and Melun, and on the same day, near Montereau. On August 1st, a similar demonstration was organized in Rue de Guerre as in Rue de Bussy. The demonstrators were covered by Georges Vallee, Rousseau, Pellet, Dupic and B. Daguerre, with a speech to the crowd addressed Lisa Ricot. In addition to Valmy's group, subordinated directly to the central apparatus of the party, several other groups appeared, which in 4 or 5 months carried out as many operations as the partisans from Mont-sur-Loing. It was only through carelessness that the first guerrilla group operating in France was exposed. On August 11, 1942, Raymond Georges and another guerrilla got off the train at the station of Mort-le-Sablon, but left a revolver on a bench in the car. The conductor who discovered the bundle immediately handed it over to the stationmaster and outlined the appearance of its probable owners. At the exit from the station room, the assistant stationmaster detained Raymond as companion. Realizing what was the matter, Lucien escaped from the hands of the railway clerk and fled. The gendarmes searched the entire neighborhood, but without success. Unfortunately, the police had Raymonda's identity, and she was soon arrested. From the documents found in her possession, the police established her role in our organization, as well as the connection she had with the interregional commissioners. On the morning of August 12, 1942, the gendarmes combed the entire area of the Calvera camp. Lucien was arrested at the Fontainebleau train station. In the afternoon, 7 comrades armed with revolvers fought the gendarmes and 24 German soldiers who tried to capture them. The comrades managed to break through the encirclement ring. During the firefight, 1 German soldier was killed, but André Boisier fell in the battle. The rest of the comrades escaped. Later, we created several partisan groups in the departments of Seine-et-Marne, Seine and Oise, but the most numerous, powerful and fighting partisan forces in France were in Paris and its suburbs. The capital's houses, apartments, and individual rooms served as shelters from which fighters came out in the mornings and evenings, gathered in groups and detachments, and waged guerrilla warfare, which soon merged with guerrilla fighting in the countryside.